Welcome to the Secret Lives of Fingle's Dormice. I'm so glad you could join us. It's great to see so many of you. My name is Eleanor Lewis and I am the Community Engagement Officer at Fingle, which is the wood you're going to hear about very shortly. And I will be your chair today. I think you're in for a real treat. A combination of being nocturnal, spending lots of time kind of high up in trees and being quite rare makes the dormouse a very elusive creature. We've been really lucky. We've been monitoring them for over 6 years at Fingle. And today we're going to be giving you a bit of an insight into what we've discovered and the lives of these fascinating creatures. However, before I hand over to our speakers, I've just got a couple of bits of housekeeping. Firstly, we are recording this talk, so people who aren't able to attend in person can catch up at a later date. If you don't want to be visible, you can turn off your video. This can be done by clicking the video button on the control bar at the bottom of your screen. Due to the limited amount of time and the number of attendees, all guests will be muted throughout. However, there'll be plenty of opportunity to engage and ask questions via the chat box. Again, this can be found by clicking on the chat box button at the bottom of your screen. There are a number of Woodland Trust staff behind the scenes manning the chat box and providing technical support. So if you do have any problems at all, there is an option to kind of privately message the host there. The talk is going to last approximately 45 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. So if anything occurs to you at any point during the talk that you want to know more about, just pop it in the chat box and we will either respond to it then, or otherwise we will address all kind of unanswered questions at the end. So today I am joined by David Rickwood, who is the project manager and also the site manager at Fingle Woods, and Matt Parkins, who is a local ecologist who has been leading on all of the dormouse surveys in the woods. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dave and Matt.
Yeah, hi everyone. As Ellie says, welcome to the talk we're giving today. I'm going to try and sort of set the scene really and give you a bit of background, and then that'll lead into some more dormice focused slides towards the end of the presentation. But this was a picture that we took in the spring, in the early spring, in April this year during the first lockdown. Sadly, we're about to go into another one, but it was seemed quite fitting to have a sort of double rainbow overlooking the Fingle Valley. So for those of you who are not familiar with where this site is, that's quite a good view. If we can flick on a slide, please. And if you're unfamiliar with where Fingle is in terms of the geography in the country, that little red blob in the middle of the map is Fingle Woods. It's just north of a town called Moreton Hampstead, which is on Dartmoor on the northern edge of the moorland itself. You may have seen it. Sometimes people are aware of the name Fingle from driving down to Cornwall on their holidays, because there's a sign saying Fingle Bridge on the A30 as people whiz on past down to Cornwall. If we flick on again. So this is a picture that we call Teen Tail, but it gives you a sense of the landscape of the Teen Valley. So there are 9 river systems that rise on Dartmoor. And in this picture here, you can see in the far distance, that horizon is the high moor of Dartmoor, and the big rounded hillside on the right-hand side is Cosden Beacon. And that's one of the largest and tallest mountains or hillsides on the northern edge of Dartmoor. But the river itself rises in the mid-distance. There's a small sort of pimple on the ridgeline, which is called Little Hound Tor, and the river rises just below that. So it's about 4 or 5 miles you're looking at there. But the most important aspect to consider here is this is a very steep, precipitous valley. It's referred to as the Teen Gorge. And Fingle Woods sits on the kind of left-hand side of the gorge. And these are important valley systems on Dartmoor, and they're some of the most important in terms of biodiversity and the range of species and habitats they provide. If we flick on again. So just a little bit of background about the Woodland Trust itself. The gentleman on the left is a man called Ken Watkins, and he was the founder of the Woodland Trust. And he ran an agricultural engineering business with his brother on the south side of Dartmoor for most of his kind of working life. But he had a wide range of interests, and wildlife was one of those interests. And on the right-hand side, there's a picture of a field mouse, and he was a keen amateur photographer, and he made a number of short films, and he made a short film about field mice, and he won a BBC award for that film, and this is a still taken from that. And those images were often used by what became the BBC's Natural History Unit. It's lovely to think that Ken Watkins was involved in some of the emerging technologies around filming and watching wildlife, which we're going to do as we move the presentation on. If we move on another slide. So this connection with wildlife goes a little bit deeper. So the gentleman here with the apron on, who seems to be looking after this poor bird on the table, is a chap called H.G. Hurrell. And he was a lifelong friend of Ken Watkins. And between them, they set up what originally became, or what has become today, the Devon Wildlife Trust. And that was formed about 10 years before Ken Watkins set up what became the Woodland Trust. But what's actually happening here is both Ken and H.G. Hurrell were involved in rescuing persecuted birds or injured birds, and they set up a network of veterinary surgeons who could actually assist and repair broken wings and damaged birds. There was a lot of, in that sort of post-war period, there was a lot of sort of persecution of particularly raptors of one sort or another. And so there was a need to do this. If we move on another slide. And so to the dormice. I'll let Matt tell us a little bit about this individual. But Fingle Woods is about 1,000 acres in total. So it's a big woodland complex, and it sits within a much bigger woodland complex. So overall, that wooded valley we were looking at is about 2,500 acres of woodland. It's very busy with a complex array of wildlife, but the dormouse actually is a real feature throughout the valley. And they have a strong population, not only in Devon, but particularly in places like the Tean Valley. And we're very, very lucky to have such a species within the woodland. But I'm going to pass over to Matt here now and say, Matt, what can you tell us about this little individual here?
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Dartmoor. So this young dormouse, it looks rather small in my hand there, is a juvenile, and the photo was taken roughly this time last year. And it's the time of year when some of the older, more mature dormice have gone into hibernation, and a few of the younger ones are still putting on some weight before they manage to build up that sufficient store of fat before they go into hibernation. So this is one a photo taken from Fingle Woods, and it's connected to some of the research that we've been doing, finding out just how quickly at this time of year these dormice can actually put on that weight. So a friend of mine who's studying a PhD in hibernation of dormice does have a license to actually microchip some of these, so we can follow one individual and we can look at the amazing weight gain that they can increase their body weight by in these crucial weeks before the winter comes. A few general things about dormice is that Dave mentioned there is a stronghold populations around Devon, and in Fingle Woods we're very fortunate to be able to have dormice there, but they are very vulnerable species, and their numbers are reducing rapidly across the country due to loss of habitat and the effects of changing climate. And we know from recent studies that their numbers have dropped by around 50% in the last 20 or so years, and that's quite staggering, really, when you think about it. So it's upon us, where we have these interesting species, to maintain those habitats, and if possible improve the habitats, and hopefully, you know, keep this species going. So next slide, please, Tom. One of the first jobs that Dave asked me to do when Fingle was taken over for the restoration project, jointly by the Woodland Trust and National Trust. So he asked me to do a complete walkover site survey and look for signs of dormice, and then we could map them all. So another name for the species is the hazel dormouse, because they're well known for nibbling hazelnuts in this particular way. And so on the left there, you can see this very smooth entry hole, and they actually rotate the nut around. So there's one example just there. So they rotate the nut round as they're gnawing their way through the shell to get to the nut inside, and they leave a very distinctive mark, so you can tell one species from another. So you can separate the dormouse from the bank vole and the wood mouse, etc. And then in the lower photo there, they do a similar thing to cherry stones. So this is a wild cherry. They eat the fruit, and then they go boring through the seed to try and get the kernel from inside. And this is a good way of being quite precise about different areas of the wood where you have the presence of the species. So the next one, please, Tom. And I'll talk about the bottom photo there. So this is a little contraption that we call a nest tube. It's a little plastic tube that goes up in the trees, and there's a sliding wooden tray with a blocked end, and it's another useful way to work out are dormice present in the woods. So you can see this little woven structure there is a nest that's been built by a dormouse. So generally this system of monitoring is just to find the presence of the dormice, and you don't normally find the live animals in there, but occasionally you do. So the photo at the top there, that's one in its torpid pose, not hibernating, but that period either in the spring or in the autumn when they're conserving their energy. So that's the sort of classic cute curled up dormouse pose there. Next one, please. And as a species, they build these particularly interesting, quite elaborate nests, which again is a sign of them being in the woods. If you can find these sort of things, obviously they're very well camouflaged, built from all the local foliage and leafy material. This is a fairly textbook nest. It's got the woven core with a layer of insulating leaves all around the outside. I've just got one here if I can show it to you. This one's a little bit older, and I'll just point that towards the camera there, so you can actually see just in the center there. So the dormouse will go in and out of this central core, and it's all woven around, beautifully constructed with a leafy layer, exterior layer there to protect them from the cold. And the next one, please, Tom. So this is a particularly interesting nest that was actually built by a dormouse recently. Now, later on in this slideshow, you'll see a short video of this one actually being built by the dormouse. And I just briefly checked the nest box and where it was being filmed, just to have a look at it and take a photo of it. But again, you can see that fabulous internal structure there. It's like a ball of vegetation with all the leafy structure around the outside. And the next one, please. So through the woods, we've got a few sets of nest boxes which are part of the National Dormouse Monitoring Programme. And as a standard way of monitoring the activities and the populations of dormice across the country, you have this standard sized nest box. And I'll just briefly show you one here. So if you ever are walking in the woods and you see this nest box looking like that with no hole in the front, but the hole is actually around the back, and this side goes up against the tree, as a tree climbing species, they run up and down the tree and then enter this hole, which mimics a natural tree hole. And so they quite frequently like to use these nest boxes. And it's a way that we can actually then catch the animals, and with a sufficient amount of training and expertise, we can take all the biometric measurements. So we weigh them, we sex them, we look at their health and how many young they're having and all that sort of thing. So this goes on across the country, and it's often a volunteer-led activity too. So we do have some volunteers at Fingle Woods who I'm training to become a licensed dormouse monitor. And the next one, please. So I mentioned that they are expert tree climbers. Now, we've got a new study running at Fingle Woods, which is supported by the People's Trust for Endangered Species. And you can see from this little piece of card here that there are some small footprints on there. I'll just show you one of these pieces of card. So this is what they look like, and these go inside a plastic tunnel, and they're slightly different from the nest tube that you saw earlier, and they're an open-ended plastic tunnel, and they there's no bait in there or anything like that, but they're just a little cavity where the dormouse might be interested just to go in and check out its surroundings. Maybe it goes in there for shelter, and there's a little sticky ink pad at the end of the piece of paper there, and they leave some footprints behind. So it's another very good way for us to check the presence of dormice. And we have a big study going at the moment where we've got 150 of these footprint tunnels, and Dave will tell you a little bit more later about the reason why we're doing this. It's after some trees were felled, and we're looking at how the habitat is recovering. We're using the dormice as a indicator. I'll just briefly show you, if I can bring it close there. So these are footprints from a dormouse. Now, just here, you can see this little set of triangular pads, and then in front of it, you've got 3 little toes in a row. Now, this little arrangement here is very, very peculiar to the dormouse because of the way their feet have adapted to tree climbing. So we'll go on and show you about that in a moment. But just at the bottom there, you can see, you can compare the dormouse print with the prints of a wood mouse as well. So there's this distinction between the two.
Matt, can I ask a question about the toes?
Yeah.
Are there five digits in effect, 3 forward and 2 back?
That's right. So the triangular pads are the actual pads, as if these soft pads are the equivalent on our hands, and then the three toes that point forwards, but the other 2 you can see slightly out to the side. So the first and the 5th digit are sticking out either side.
Okay.
So I think we're ready for the next slide, please. So that's a nice close-up shot then of the dormouse's foot, and you can see these little soft, sticky little pads enable them to climb. And again, we'll see a video in a short while and watch their ability as tree climbers. It's really very impressive. The next one, please. And that's one of our 150 footprint tunnels in situ. We found a way of where these trees have been felled, fixing them up so that they don't actually need to be on a tree. Now, you may say, why would a dormouse go in there? Well, that habitat that you're looking at, that scrub of regenerating willow, bramble, bracken, it's a big tangled habitat there. but it's a very, very good habitat as the woodland's redeveloping and recolonizing the areas where the trees have been felled. It's a very good habitat, and we do get some good results from the footprint tunnels there.
So Matt,
yes, sorry, Dave.
That post is quite isolated, but they're clearly inquisitive enough to find out things.
Yeah, well, what tends to happen, this photo was taken early in the spring, and as the bracken grows up and the brambles trail around, then it becomes pretty much engulfed by the habitat, and it obviously through the summer it looks a little bit less isolated and becomes a good little part of the habitat. I just wanted to quickly mention that this is part of a larger study which is enabling us to work with other organizations as well. So we're looking at working with some academic institutions. We're currently working with Imperial College in London, and they're taking some of these footprint results, and they'll be looking for environmental DNA on those bits of the bits of paper I was showing you. And this is going to be another, hopefully working towards another method of monitoring which species are out there in the environment. So it's good to be working with them and providing them with plenty of samples. It's also interesting to watch through the period of the spring and the summer and the autumn how the dormice use the site at different times of year, and it's raising some questions for us to try and understand their behavior a little bit more. So as you get the blossom in the springtime, that's a good food source. You see the dormice concentrating their activities in certain areas of the site, and then as the summer progresses you may get berries such as rowan berries, and then you can observe that the dormice are moving into those kind of areas. And it would be quite nice to work with the University of Exeter. We're just having talks with them at the moment to get a few of their researchers to come out and do some more scientific work on the site.
Matt, I think you've got a slide coming up in a minute that will explain it better, but there is a question about what environmental DNA is, but maybe if we pick that up when we look at that bit of video.
Yeah, okay, we'll go on to the next one.
So shall I pick this one up, Matt?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so when we acquired Fingle Woods back in sort of 2014, one of the first jobs really is to try and assess the habitat across the whole forest. And there are some key species like dormice, but there are a number of other aspects that we initially undertake in terms of a whole suite of surveys to try and get a grasp and an understanding of the woodland habitat, the species it's supporting, and the impacts that might have for the management of the woodlands. So dormice are what we call an EPS, so that's a European protected species, so they're protected by laws in particular ways. So we have to be very conscious of the work we do and its impacts on particular species like the dormice. So Matt undertook a couple of surveys initially back just after we acquired the site, and then it was repeated again in 2018. And the good news is that the work that we've done in the forest has actually expanded the amount of habitat available for dormice, that not only that have we created more habitat, but they're actually using it and expanding in terms of their population and their range. Do you want to say anything on that, Matt, or should we move on?
No, that's a good first study of where we think they are, and it is really interesting to see how the woodland restoration work is beginning to benefit many of these species, and surprisingly quickly in some cases.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. So somewhat surprisingly, given that Fingle is probably 70% conifer, and that was one of the key reasons why the Woodland Trust looked to acquire Fingle, because it was a restoration project of a very, very large area of ancient woodland. It's really busy with dormice. I think we've been genuinely surprised at the numbers of dormice within the forest. And so as a consequence, we've got 3 nest box schemes, and Matt's talked a little bit about those and how they feed into a national data collection effort with People's Trust for Endangered Species. But then we've also had 3 PhD studies. One is still ongoing. Initially, a lady called Dr. Cecily Goodwin did a piece of work tracking dormice during felling operations and restoration operations. A chap called Leo Goubert looked at one looking at hibernation of dormice and where dormice were hibernating. And somewhat surprisingly, I think there's an assumption that dormice sort of hibernate in the bottoms of trees and in the root systems of hazel. And actually they hibernate much more in the open. And I think that was something that was quite interesting to all of us, really. And then lastly, there's this one about eDNA, and we'll pick that up in a minute when Matt shows another slide. But restoration involves tree removal, but one of the things that's causing us a really significant headache, really, is tree disease. And Fingle is no different from many other sites that's had its impacts with tree disease. But we've had an issue with a disease called Phytophthora ramorum, which affects Japanese larch. And I don't know if you can flick on a slide, Tom. So all of these dots here are incidences of this disease, Phytophthora ramorum. And when this disease is discovered, the plant health people from DEFRA issue something called a sort of an order for you to actually remove all the diseased trees. And that's normally within a 6-month period. So it requires you to actually fell a huge amount of tree cover in a relatively small period and short period of time. So across the southwest and across South Wales, that's meant around about 12 to 14,000 hectares of woodland has been felled. So that's, well, Fingle is about 350 hectares. So that'll give you some idea of the scale of the amount of woodland that's been felled. And that has undoubtedly had quite a significant impact on a whole range of species. So part of the work we're trying to do at Fingle is understand what that impact is and whether when your hand is forced and you need to fell these trees, there's a certain degree of mitigation that can be undertaken both before and after in order that you can actually help protect some of these species. So it's a big issue, tree disease, and the impacts of ash and the felling that's going to have to follow with ash dieback, we've really yet to see. So this is a good kind of learning curve for what tree disease means. If we could move on a slide, Tom. So I'll hand over to Matt at this point.
Right, so we've got a bit of expertise within the team, and we've set up a few CCTV cameras inside one or two of the dormouse boxes. And we first did this 2 years ago, so you can see the date there is summer 2018, and we were looking at just, can we learn more about their behaviour from viewing them in the box? I was also keen to not disturb them, so we noticed that they sometimes checked out the cameras but then went about being a dormouse and doing their natural things. And this particular time, July 2018, it was a very hot summer, and we found that they were using the nest boxes but weren't actually building nests, which was the first interesting thing. And we studied them for what appeared to be a long time, spending looking after their coat, grooming like that. So any ticks and fleas and that kind of thing they'd be picking off. This one's currently looking at its tail, inspecting its tail there, which is an important part of its anatomy, which helps them balance as they climb. And yes, we just noticed that they obviously it was very important to have a good fur coat as a dormouse.
And
so
is it fair to say in that summer, Matt, a lot of dormouse recorders were worried that there weren't very many nest boxes with nests?
They were. We have the dormouse people across the country have a forum where we have these discussions, and people were saying, we've got no dormice, there are no nests. But we'd observed at the time that that they were just warm enough without them, just for that period of the summer. So and then this one went out for the night then at 9:45 at night at that particular time. So we'll move on now to the next one, Tom. This is a new video then. This is what I was explaining earlier. We're actually lucky enough to get the camera on the right box while this young dormouse started building a nest. We hoping to get to understand their behaviour a little bit more. So this is a small one. It's a juvenile that was born some maybe up to 100 meters away from this particular nest box, but here it is looking for a new place to start building its first nest as an independent young dormouse. So we set up this camera rig. So we've got one trail camera on the outside, and you can see that little white box there. Inside there is a little CCTV camera which leads down to Tom's highlighting it for you there, which leads down to a recorder and a battery. So this one's just brought a leaf inside, and we were quite impressed with the way they unfolded a leaf. So they go out, collect their leaf, fold it all up, bring it in, and then unfold it. So this one spent quite some time. We're moving on quite quickly there. So a lot of the outer bit of the nest has been built there, and it's still bringing in leaves. If you watch that one unfold the leaf. So having never built a nest before, I was quite impressed that that they instinctively know how to do this and do a good job of it. So watch carefully now. It's just brought in there some of the strandy material. So it's grass, it's stripped bark from honeysuckle. It's more of this fibrous material that it's actually constructing now. You can see it working on the inside there, building this woven core to the nest. And I think we may see it come back in again. Oh, here it is, and it's just finishing off. So it's having a little think about what to do, and it'll pick up that leaf. Watch this. Just folded it all up into a little bundle and made a few last adjustments to the bottom end of the nest there. And it went to sleep for the rest of that day. And it was really interesting. We've spent hours and hours and hours watching this one, and condensed that down just to a couple of minutes. But there's lots more footage that we have, and again we can learn about their behaviour. So we'll move on now, Tom. And this, again, going back 2 years ago, another nest that we were lucky enough to pick up and get the camera in the right place. So this is a female. She's just raising 2 young ones in there. So watch really closely at the bottom. You see a little face there. That's the young one. So she's cleaning that one, and it's actually trying to suckle. So the mother is looking after them and doing a very good job. I'm very impressed of their maternal abilities and instincts. They do an incredible job raising these young dormice. So I think what we're going to see in a moment then is later on the mother then, after a few weeks, will leave the nest and left these 2 young ones behind. So this is one of them now. They're a little bit, well, they're significantly bigger, not adult size, but here they are, 2 siblings in the nest on their own without the mother. She's probably nearby, not too far away. I think we can probably just see them moving around a little bit. But again, here we are. So you'll see both of them moving around in the nest box now. They're quite sociable creatures at certain times of year. A little bit more territorial, obviously during the summer when the mating season, but at the start of the year and the end of the year, they can be quite sociable, and you often find 2, 3, or even 4 in a nest together.
And Matt, do they move around boxes?
Yes, yes, they do. These 2 were particularly interesting because we'd already picked them up just after they were born in one nest box. We found them again in this nest box and later on, as they were becoming young adults, we found them in a different one. So another thing that this footprint study is showing us is, I suspect, though we can't prove it just at the moment until we do more tracking or tagging, but I suspect we're seeing the dispersal of the young after the parents have kicked them out of home, and the young one then have got to go and set up their own home range, their own territory somewhere else. But hopefully, again, we'll be working with more researchers to try and understand that process a little bit more.
And how many dormice, or how many young does a female have?
Yeah, it's quite normal for them to have around 3 or 4. Occasionally, we might find 5 young when they're newborns in the nest, but to get the high survival rate is quite difficult. So sometimes we will say between 2 and 4 will perhaps make it to young adulthood. Then the next threat is the hibernation period. So that's a difficult time of year for them to get through.
And will they have more than 1 litter a year, Matt, potentially?
I think that's possible. They tend to have litters in the early summer and the late summer. Whether that's the same female doing that, that's difficult. I'm not 100% sure whether that's I guess it's possible.
Okay.
As I said, I do admire their maternal skills, but
and when they're sitting looking out the window, what they're taking the world in?
That they're currently checking, is it safe out there, is it dark enough to go out, and that sort of thing. So we can move on to the next one there, Tom. And competition to the dormouse mostly comes from the wood mouse. So that's the same nest box. That's a young dormouse coming in. This is the same pair, but we'll just watch because you'll see what follows that one in a moment. It's this competition threat from the wood mouse. They compete for food with all the other small mammals. So there are shrews, there are bank voles, grey squirrels. But if we carry on watching, just is a long pause to wait for this one to come in. But you can see here we are. This is the wood mouse, and it's a much bigger wood mouse. So this is an adult male. And this was something that we'd never seen before, was this intruder coming into the dormouse nest. And it's probably quite interested in taking over that nest. And so this fight begins. So there's one dormouse there, and they are juvenile, so they're much smaller than that wood mouse. The wood mouse are a little bit more aggressive than the dormouse as well. So we'll continue just to see what happens next.
And all this is happening in the dark.
Absolutely, yeah. So what you can see is the infrared picture. So this little dormouse is essentially fighting for its life, and it's quite lucky in a way, I suppose, that it doesn't get injured in this fight. But the wood mouse there is clearly quite dominant, and it's pinned that young dormouse down, and then off it goes. And so the wood mouse wins that fight. And those 2 dormice, then that pair of siblings, then we did find them later on in the season. So we knew they made it at least up to the hibernation stage.
And is that likely to be one of the reasons why they're moving around from box to box?
Absolutely, yes. To avoid predators and avoid that competition. Also leaving any pests and parasites in the box as well. They do move around, but I imagine safety is the major concern.
Okay, next slide.
Next one then, Tom. So we've kept some of these cameras running, and obviously we're at this stage again this year with our cameras. So once they've put on a lot of weight, and this one is at full body weight. That particular one in the hand there was almost at 40 grams, 30 something grams, and that's really quite heavy. So you can watch this one moving, and it's slowed right down in the October period, and we'll watch it just slowly work its way out of the box there. And this particular one, I think it was only days away from going into hibernation.
It always looks like it's slow motion, but it's not.
Yeah. Well, we'll see them doing some more climbing in a moment when they're young and in midsummer. So we can perhaps go to the next one, Tom. So watch this one carefully. This is this year's footage from the camera mounted looking down one of the footprint tunnels, and the DNA researcher from Imperial College was particularly interested in this. So if you look at this incredible climbing skill, the grip and the agility that they have. But we'll watch. This is a juvenile, so it's quite small, but watch really carefully as it goes through there, leaving a few footprints behind. But if you watch just there, it's just peed on the paper there. So your questions about DNA, it will leave some of its a trace of its species. You can analyze the species. I don't think they're going down to individual level yet, but those little marks, if it does droppings in there, if it leaves drops of urine behind, those are the sort of bits that can be sampled to work out which species there are in the environment. So,
and am I right to say, Matt, that part of the idea behind this eDNA, environmental DNA, is that because it's quite expensive to survey and find individual species, if you could sample an area of woodland and you have a whole range of DNA, that will give you an idea of the array of species you might have across that area.
I think, yes, it's developing technology, and it's also less intrusive a way of monitoring. So that's something that we're keen to move towards, is not actually intruding into the lives of these creatures too much. So if we can do it remotely, or just picking up something that they've left behind, then we're not affecting them too much.
So hopefully that's answered the DNA question.
So we can move on to the next one. So we're just coming to the end now, but this again is a photo of just showing their grip and their agility on in tree climbing. They are very, very impressive. Do
you want to move on?
Yeah, we can move on. So before we leave that, I did pick up one of the questions that that was asked on the chat box as it came through, and the question was, do they like rain? And in the west of the UK, the higher ground like Dartmoor, we get absolutely deluged with rain, much more than further east in the UK. And what impresses me greatly about these small creatures is where they hibernate. Now, you've seen some of the nests earlier, and they're the summer nests with all that leafy structure around them. What I'm just about to show you here is one of the hibernation nests. Now it's quite a bit smaller, so you can see the hole there, and they build this incredible little thatch, and that is in fact weatherproof for the months that they require during the winter. So it sheds rain off it. Sometimes they do degrade a little bit, and the dormouse might move during the hibernation period, build another one and settle back down again. But I'm always very impressed with the way they build these little things, and they'll actually block off that hole from the inside. So when you find these actually in amongst the leaf litter on the woodland floor, and they're just closed completely in there. This one then is this photo I took just a matter of days ago, and this is one that was less than a year old. This one was born back in the early summer, but it's put on enough weight, and it's a sub-adult. It's, by all intents and purposes, it's an adult, but they're really defined as properly adult once they've completed one hibernation. But this one has got its full little fat face and fat rump, and would be a matter of days away from hibernation. But there was a question about what is torpid. So it's at this period between being fully active and actually hibernating. So they shut down their systems so that they're saving energy. And when you handle a dormouse like this, they're actually quite cold. They're much, much colder than they are when they're active. So that's probably a good place to finish the talk for now, and we can catch up with some of your questions.
That's brilliant.
I'll say thank you very much, Matt and Dave, for that fascinating presentation. It's always lovely to get an insight into kind of the lives of the dormice and how our management is affecting them. The chat box has been busy with questions throughout, and following on from your kind of discussion around kind of torpor and hibernation, I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that slightly. So how long roughly does a dormouse kind of spend in hibernation? Do we know what the kind of the survival rate is for most dormice getting through the winter?
Okay, so this period we're in right now is where some of them are going into hibernation and some of them have not yet quite got up to that body weight. So November, December, January, February, you've got those winter months are where they're hibernating, and as I mentioned, they go down into the ground. This one was one I took out and took a photo of it and put it back into its nest. So they wouldn't be sitting on the ground without a nest normally. That's that you know, don't be misled by that photo. So the hibernation period has gone down from 6 to 7 months to 5 months or less, and this is connected with the much warmer winters that we have these days. Sorry, Ellie, was there another bit to that question?
I think that's mostly covered it, although I always find the how quickly the dormice put on their body weight in preparation for hibernation staggering. So perhaps you could explain that a little. Okay,
so with the tagging that that my colleague Leo is doing, you can actually track them one individual, and we found that they may be, their normal summer weight is usually over 15 grams but less than 20. And then you can see them approaching this autumn into winter time. You can maybe capture the same one and record its weight, and you can see that within a week it's probably almost added 50% to its body weight. So it can be well up in the mid-20s, and then maybe another week later it can be, you know, 30 grams or more. So it can easily put on 50% of its body weight in a couple of weeks. And this is an incredible adaptation to the changing season, where they just have this sort of fit tree climbing weight all the way through the summer, and then suddenly, as the weather's colder and the days are shorter, they just build up this incredible fat reserve and build a nest and settle down for the winter.
It sounds like you're describing me going into lockdown.
Well, absolutely. I admire them for that, and sometimes I wish I had that ability too.
Absolutely. There's also been a lot of questions around kind of habitat and range of dormice. So I wondered if you could kind of describe what a dormouse's kind of ideal habitat is, and if anyone listening is planning on kind of planting a woodland, are there any kind of small modifications that they could make in order to make it kind of more dormouse friendly?
Good habitat, I mean, it's often been written in textbooks that there are species of the woodland, and that is true, as long as it's a healthy woodland with all the structure of the from the ground level vegetation right the way through the shrubs up into the tree canopy. The features that they'll be looking for are the food sources. So they do like tree blossom in the spring, so crab apples. If you're planting you know, trees, think of how to have some sort of food source right the way through from the spring to the autumn, and into the early winter. So things like those blossom producing trees in the spring and the early summer. So rowan is a good one because that's got blossom, it's got berries at the end of the year. Wild cherry we mentioned earlier. Hazel is the the classic dormouse food. So they feed on the catkins in the springtime, they feed on the nuts in the autumn. Currently, I was watching Autumn Watch last week and enjoying a little bit of film of the dormice actually at this time of year eating the galls on the underside of oak leaves. So they're quite adaptable creatures. Having said that, if you have got hedgerows in your garden, they're also very, very good habitat. And so allow your hedgerow to grow a bit. The more scruffy and tangled it looks, the more protection they'll get. Perhaps the more different sources of food they might find in there as well.
I think one of the things that I mentioned it earlier is that given that Fingal is predominantly a conifer woodland, how many dormice there are. And conifer is a kind of suboptimal habitat really for dormice.
It is certainly where it's a plantation conifer. I think in other parts of the world, you've got much more of a mixed woodland, which is perhaps dominated by conifer, but there are other species within there. I think diversity is the key thing really. So we have seen them moving through the plantations of the conifers at Fingle Woods, and we're assuming that they're up in the treetops and they're collecting aphids as a food source in the summer.
Yes, yeah, so we had some heat sensor camera, didn't we, Matt? And you see the dormice moving right through the tall conifer canopies, sort of tens of meters up, in order to, as Matt says, feed on what we think were aphid populations. And I think that's been a big surprise for us, really, actually, how well adapted the species are to a whole range of habitats.
And how rapidly they are adapting. It literally was the same evening that we'd been in there doing kind of woodland management. There were brash piles on the floor and they were immediately in there kind of harvesting. So I think it was the rapidity as well as the adaptability.
They're very inquisitive creatures. So if you do make a change to their habitat, they need to go and quickly find out what's going on. And I think that's just so that they've got some kind of three-dimensional map in their mind of where to go, where the food is, and importantly where the escape routes are to go and hide.
Quite a lot of questions around where people might expect to find kind of dormice. So could you explain a bit about their kind of range? Are they present across the whole of the UK, or are they more a kind of a southerly species?
They're currently in the UK, yes. The range is decreasing at the moment, and it's pulling further south. So from here in Devon across to Kent is where you might find higher populations. Certainly South Wales and edging towards the Midlands. There are a few. There are reintroduction programs that are going on where rescue dormice are reared and then re-released further north. So I understand Nottinghamshire is becoming more of a better habitat for dormice. And I've heard of other reintroductions going on in Warwickshire. But as you get further north into the north of England and going into Scotland, then they're pretty much extinct from those areas. On a more local level, I did see one question about what's their territory or what's their range. So usually a male dormouse will range around maybe 100 meters or so. Perhaps the female's a little bit less. But again, that depends on habitat quality and the density of the population. Can that habitat support that population? And again, I talked earlier about the dispersal of the young. So they've got to move out and go and set up their own home somewhere potentially in the suboptimal habitat, which is what's really quite useful about doing this big 15-hectare study that we're looking at the moment, which is hopefully going to tell us how long it takes for a population to actually move into that habitat as it's recovering. So it's not perfect habitat, but they will start moving in at some point, and we're beginning to see the evidence of them doing that as the woodland's recovering.
We are getting quite a few questions on predators. So I was hoping you could talk a bit about whom those predators might be. So for example, one of the specific questions is around kind of whether grey squirrels pose any kind of risk to the dormouse. Right,
so predation comes from a number of sources. I mean, obviously there are birds of prey, so tawny owls will be on the lookout for a little, well, a fairly sizable meal, you know, climbing around in the trees at night time. I did see a recent video that Devon Wildlife Trust posted on social media that one of their kestrel nest boxes, so the adult kestrel was feeding a dormouse to the young kestrel, which obviously I like and admire the kestrels as well. So this is how nature obviously works. Predation on the ground is a big danger for them. So while they're hibernating, they shut down their body systems and give off very little in the way of scent and very little odor. So they are particularly hard to find for the predator, but maybe a badger or a fox might be snuffling around in the leaf litter and may come across them. But we have set up cameras on their winter nests, and it's very interesting to notice all these potential predators can completely miss that nest because they give off so little scent and so little clue that they're there. I think that the grey squirrel, mentioning that particular species, is perhaps more of a threat to the food source. So they do consume a lot of the same sort of food sources, including the hazelnuts. So they're potentially an actual direct predator, but it's that competition for food which is posing a potential problem.
So Matt, how many years would you expect an adult to potentially live for? How many seasons might it go through?
Yeah, so if they make it through that first hibernation, then they have a good chance of going through, maybe getting to the age of about 3 or 4 years old. Now Leo, again, this is the beauty of the microchipping that he's doing, has recorded one locally that's 5 years old, and he can tell you the whole life history of that particular individual, how many litters she's had, where she's moved around, precisely what her range is, where she is at different times of year, and that sort of thing. But 5 is a grand old age for a dormouse.
And what sort of range do you think they cover? Do you think that is is habitat dependent, or?
I would say it's habitat dependent. Yes, I mean if they're occupying a hedgerow, then it's a completely different sort of feature, isn't it? So yeah, 50 to 100 meters within a decent habitat is quite good, and that obviously depends on nesting opportunities and feeding opportunities as well.
We are running out of time, so should wrap up, but just a couple of things before we go. So the first is quite a lot of people have expressed a kind of an interest in following the dormouse story, with requests about whether we had a live stream on YouTube, for example. So unlike with the kind of the ospreys up in Scotland, we don't have a live stream from Fingle. But lots of this footage can be found on the Fingle blog and on the Fingle Facebook page. So I will pop both the links to both of those in the chat box shortly. But you will also, after this event, receive a follow-up email, and there'll be more information about how you can kind of follow the story there. There's also been a number of questions about whether people should check for dormice in their local area, whether you can open kind of boxes, and there's obviously very strict rules about kind of looking at and monitoring and surveying dormouse. So before everyone excitedly goes out and kind of starts poking around in the local boxes, I just wondered if you could quickly cover that, Matt.
Okay, so yes, their level of protection is very high in legal terms, and so actually disturbing their habitat is something that requires a license. So this monitoring of nest boxes is something that does require a Natural England license. So what I would suggest is, firstly, if you are walking in the woods and you see those nest boxes that appear to be the wrong way around, then just please don't touch those. They are being monitored by somebody who has a license, but just be aware and be happy that where you are walking at that particular time, there are dormice present in that woodland. But one thing I would say, that if you suspect, if you're in the right part of the country, if you suspect you may have dormice in your garden, in your local hedgerow or something like that, then you could put up one of these footprint tunnels, which maybe it's worth us sending out a link to that, because that's something that you don't actually have to capture or disturb the animals themselves. They can just walk in and out as they choose and leave you some of these clues behind. So and again, if you've got 100 to 200 pounds, there's a whole range of trail cameras that you can buy, these night vision cameras. We've almost found that just setting one up within a hedge or any suitable sort of habitat, you might actually see things crawling around at night time. So give that one a try as well.
Perfect. Well, Matt, Dave, thank you again for the presentation and for fielding all of those questions. Lots of really lovely feedback in the comments box. But above all, thank you all for joining us today and for supporting the work of the Woodland Trust. All of the kind of the management and the species monitoring that you've been hearing about today wouldn't be possible without your support. So thank you very much. And there will be a follow-up email, so look out for that, because it will contain links to where you can find more information. But also, if you do have any further questions, then myself, Matt or Dave would be more than happy to field any of those. So please just reply to that email and we will get back to you. But thanks again for joining us and have a good evening. Bye.